Well, I'd like to tell you a couple of stories of my experience here in Alaska. My first station of ministry was in Nome, Alaska, and there was a woman that had pioneered in Nome, and her name was Harriet Brown. She originally came to Alaska with just a quarter in her pocket as a single woman missionary, which just fascinated me because when I lived in Nome, that's what I was. I was a single missionary. I was still kind of in college and out of college. I did my internship there, and so I wanted to hear how do you survive in this sort of environment, and does God really care about the choices that you make? And so she told me a story one day when she was in Nome, and back in those days it was pretty much a wilderness territory and all kinds of activities going on, and she was by herself, and one day she was kind of lonely and kind of down, and she was walking along the beach. Nome has got gorgeous beaches. They still to this day will mine gold from the beach, and it's just a fantastic area. Tundra, you can see all kinds of moose, and there's vegetation, and then there's these gorgeous mountains that are in the background. So you've got the ocean in front of you, you've got these amazing mountains behind you, and here she is, she's walking along the ocean, along the seashore there, and she's singing. And told me she was singing praises, and she's just communing with God, and she's lifting her hands up and saying, "Thank you, God, for this great day." And then she'd put her hands down, lift her hands up, and well, one time when her hands came down, somebody grabbed her hand, and she was like, I think this is like a God moment going on. And so she was too afraid to look. So she just continued singing. And as she sang, she said her heart just became renewed and she was refreshed. And so she finally got enough boldness up to look over and see who was holding her hand. And she looked, and there was no one there. And she was convinced that the hand she was holding to was the hand of God. And to her, what that meant was, that meant, Harriet, you're going to be okay. I'm God. I'm right here. I'm holding your hand. And for me, what that said to me was, that said that no matter where I was in the world, all I had to do was obey God, and He would pour out His blessings. And as I would take a step of faith, He'd be there to hold my hand, and everything would be okay. Which reminds me of another great story. Another woman who I just really admired during my tenure here in Alaska. Her name is Nora. And Nora told this great story about, this is back several years ago when her husband was out hunting, and that's how they provided for the family, is to go out hunting. And he was out hunting, and she was left with a small child, and not very much food in the house, and it was very cold, and it was winter, and her child was sick, and she was weak, and she was like, Lord, one morning she was praying, she's like, Lord, I just don't know if I can make it. You need to really, could you send me some help? And so it was just not too long after that when a knock came at the door, and she opened up the door, and on the other side of this door was this woman who she had never met before, but there was this countenance about this woman that was inviting and was comforting and had such a peace. And so she welcomed this woman into her home, which is very customary here in Alaska. No matter where you go, the welcome mat is always open, and the lights are always on, and we are very welcoming people here. And so Nora welcomed this woman in, and oh, they had this beautiful conversation, and she was feeling refreshed and just comforted. And the woman said, you know, why don't you just go ahead and take a little rest, and let me care for the baby, and everything will be just fine. And Nora normally wouldn't do something like this with a stranger in her home, but again, she just felt like everything was okay. So she went to her room, closed the door, and she had the best sleep she's had in days, perhaps weeks. And when she woke up, she was like, what's that wonderful smell? See, she walked out into her living room, and clothes were folded that had been piled up, and the house was clean, and the smell she was smelling was fresh bread and beautiful cupcake cakes, and oh, it was just wonderful. Her house was just changed. It was amazing, and Nora was stunned. She didn't know what to say. She didn't know what to do. This lady, and the lady looked at her and said, "Okay, thank you very much for letting me be with you. I must go now." And she turned around and walked out the door, and Nora was like speechless, didn't even know what to say. And when she finally came to her senses, she ran to the door to thank this woman. She opened up the door and she counted. There was 1, 2, 3 steps in the fresh fallen snow, and then there was no more footprints. No more footprints. What could that mean? That could only mean she was visited by an angelic being. And from that day until forever, she was like, God's with me. He cares about me. He knows where I am, and He's going to take care of me. What a great testimony that is. God's provision, God's care, God's love.